am Tom LeClaire. I am the Clayton historian, and we're thankful that you're coming out to our Sesquicentennial History at Noon program, a program that's brought to you by the Thousand Islands Museum, the Historian's Office, which I am part of, the Sesquicentennial Planning Committee, and the Clayton Opera House. We're all working together to bring you these great programs. They're free. I say they're free. We have a donation, but that goes to the food pantry. So we're trying to help out not only ourselves, but we're trying to help out our friends in the community. So again, it's been a very busy year with the Sesquicentennial. I do want to remind you that Friday night this week is the Ghost Tour. If you're interested, show up at the Thousand Islands Museum between 7:30 and 7:45. There is a $10 charge for that one. $5 goes to the museum, $5 goes to the group that's hosting the Ghost Tour. On Saturday at noon down here at Frink Park, we got a big Sesquicentennial event starting again at noon. We got some speakers, the mayor's involved, her program actually, her village. And then at 2 o'clock, we got a cornet band that's going to be doing some old style music like they would have listened to back in 1872. So you need to come out to that event. So, but today, Carl Frink, not you, your grandfather, right? Mm-hmm. Your grandfather, all right? Very big person in the village as far as the Frink snowplow, and employed hundreds and hundreds of people, kept the village going. One of the major contributors to our prospering as a village. But grandson, Carl Ryman, is going to be talking about Grandpa Frink today. So with that, I want to thank you for being here, and I'm turning the time over to you.
Hi, my name is Carl Ryman. I'm the only surviving grandson of Carl Frink. There are 5 surviving granddaughters. My sister Ann, my cousin Christine Frink, my cousin Betty Frink, my cousin Carol Frink, and my cousin Pamela Frink. And occasionally they show up here in Clayton. I'm going to start a little bit with my grandfather Frank's family. His ancestors came from England in the late 1600s and settled in Connecticut and founded the town of Stonington, Connecticut. Eventually, some of the family migrated up this way into the Rutland Hills. Some of them were farmers, some of them were businessmen in the Carthage area, and that's where my grandfather was born. The family became acquainted with the actually tinsmithing business. Would have been my grandfather Frank's dad, Heman Frink, was apprenticed in the 1800s as a tinsmith, early 1800s, and that kind of work is where my grandfather learned tinsmithing, and that's why Mr. Daly, Fred Daly, who had the bus line here, approached my grandfather because he knew tinsmithing. He knew how to work with metal and bend it and shape it. And that's how all that became about, was because there was a history in the family of tinsmithing. And my sister and I actually have some of the containers, water dippers, and some of the things that date back way, way, way far back in our family. Fortunately, we still have that. As you well know, it's widely, when you read about it, Fred Daly owned a bus line here between Clayton and Watertown, and was having trouble keeping the road open between Clayton and Watertown, which we now know is Route 12. At that time, it was just a gravel road, and at times, Mr. Daly would hire a lot of people to literally, with snow shovels, go shovel it so his bus could run between Clayton and Watertown. And he got tired of that, I guess, and approached my grandfather to come up with some kind of a contraption to keep the road open in the winter. There are a lot of wonderful photographs of early snowplows and things. Some of them Mr. Clare brought are over here, but there are many more over at the museum, if anybody ever was interested in it. His first manufacturing, he started manufacturing snowplows in right around 1920. His first plant was on James Street, now where the market is up there, and there's a play thing. That was the first Frank plant. Outgrew that extremely quickly, and then, still in the 1920s, built the plant that's down here where the hotel is today, and it remained there until the 2000s when it was torn down and the site was remediated. That grew exponentially over the years, started small and just kept growing. As the business kept growing, the plant kept growing. And what really fueled the growth of Frank snowplows was the government during the Great Depression was building a lot of roads. And they needed snowplows to clear it. And he wasn't necessarily, I don't think, the first one to put a plow on a motorized vehicle, but he was the first one to patent it. And almost everything we know today in modern snow removal, the one-way, the power reversible, the wing, all were patented by him. He was the first one to patent the snowplows. The rollover, which is famous, was his engineer, Bill Kenyon. Some of you may remember him. He and his wife Ruth lived here. And his one son is still here, Damon. And he was an engineer, worked his entire life for my grandfather Frank, and was a brilliant engineer. So he contributed a lot over the years to Frank's success with some of the designs. He had a lot of interesting, early on, part of what helped him grow were alliances with truck manufacturers. And the first one, you'll see some pictures over here, called Linn, L-I-N-N, and they were made here in New York State, and essentially was a half-track that was developed for the logging industry. The Linn half-track would look like a train pulling, a lot of times in the winter on skis, stacks of logs out of the wood. And I think originally they tried their own version of a snowplow. It didn't work very well. I approached my grandfather Frank, and they put typically V-plows and wings on the Linn half-tracks. And I think every county up in northern New York and a lot of other places that was their main snowplow, was a Linn half-track with a freight plow on it. And that continued on until Linn eventually went out of business. Once that stopped, the next business partnership, and I don't know whether I'm sure there are people here that remember a Walter Snowfighter. And my grandfather actually had a lot of input into that truck. He wanted a truck that he felt was tough enough for the snowplows and plowing. And so he worked with Mr. Walters on the design of that truck. And that lasted, oh my gosh, probably into the 60s. And ironically, his grandson has a place on Mosey Island. So, interesting. There's also a lot of pictures of Walter Snowfighters. And then there was Frank of Canada, which was a separate business unit. And my grandfather licensed his patents to Frank of Canada. And so he got royalties from that. Occasionally when we were kids, we would go over there and visit the plant on occasion. He also licensed his patents to a company in Iowa that made Frank snowplows. And most people don't realize that. And that was in, I want to say Waterloo, but it wasn't. It was in eastern Iowa. And they built Frank snowplows basically for out west, Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado. And eventually that went away and everything was produced here in Clayton. As a young child, I walked around the plant with my grandfather until I was 8 years old. He passed away. And I was always fascinated by the welders. And when I would watch welding, I got a pretty good slap on the head. Because he was worried I was going to get flash burn in my eyes. And I still remember that to this day. There are a lot of numerous people here in the community that have worked there, hundreds of people over the years, maybe thousands, I don't know. Some of his earliest employees were people like Carl Wells, people wouldn't remember here. He passed away in the 1950s. Mike Wagner was a foreman. Tommy Slate. So there were a lot of local names involved here. They brought a foreman over from Canada in probably the late 50s, early 60s by the name of Gordon White, who was a foreman at the plant. Then later on, there were other people. They were, when it got busy, they would run sometimes 3 shifts to try to keep up. And unfortunately, the way the state budgets and local budgets work, they were all happened in the beginning of the year. And so that's when they ordered all their snowplows, and it was winter, and they wanted them now. Not later, now. And so it became extremely busy over there. My family was still involved in the business. My mom and dad, my Uncle Howland, until he passed away in 1960. Then in the mid-60s, my family sold it to the Simpson family in Canada, who had a number of years, and eventually they sold it, and basically never put really any money back into it. They just took money and didn't put money back into it. There was a disastrous fire that I can still remember. I believe it was 1960. I can remember my dad getting up in the middle of the night with a call from somebody at the fire department that the plant was on fire. Well, at that time, what they did was they actually painted the snowplows within the plant, and that's where the fire started. And so it pretty much, there was a fire door between the area that had been added on the south side of the plant that prevented the trucks that were being fed with the snowplows from getting burned. It got so hot in there that it melted the grease out of the bearings and stuff, but the trucks remained, other than that, untouched. My dad had purchased a piece of ground on the south side of the East Line Road that eventually Gerald Ingerson ended up buying. And before the fire, they were planning to actually move the plant out there and build a big new modern plant that had a good workflow to it. This plant had been added onto, re-added onto, and the workflow wasn't very good. And they had all the plans. The railroad had come in, reworked the tracks from town out to that area so that they could move all the equipment by rail. At that time, the railroad was still here. And they were going to do a spur into the plant to bring the steel in. I can still remember that, the gondola cars just full of steels from Pittsburgh. I can remember my grandfather Frank, my dad, my Uncle Howland, whenever the United Steelworkers were going to go on strike, going to Pittsburgh and buying a lot of steel, because if they struck, they couldn't get steel, they couldn't build snowplows. I can remember them putting a huge shear in there. Took 2 huge cranes that came in on a railroad car and they literally took the roof out of the plant. This would have been in the 50s, early 60s, and the 2Q crane picked the shear up and put it inside the plant because they were going to have to move too much other stuff to get it in. And so that was a lot. There was a lot of stuff in there, pantographs, and maybe hydraulic cylinders. And that's one of the things you'll see in the old pictures, which is very interesting. All the early snow plows, the original ones, were underslung, and everything was hand, if you can imagine, hand winching up a great big V-plow on the front. You'll notice the picture of the chains coming over the top. There was a extensive framework because of how they operated everything. There's a picture over there that shows two guys in the back of the truck, one on one side, one on the other, and each one operated the wings by hand. And I can't remember the exact date, but along came hydraulics, which was a godsend, because then you didn't have to have winchmen on your snowplow trucks to winch the front plow and the wings up. They also made snow blowers. Most people don't remember that. They made brooms that you could fit on your front mount for your snow plows to sweep the streets or the roads. Again, there's a lot of pictures over there. There's an interesting picture that we actually have from the collection from the TI Museum that shows sort of the transition from the underslung plow to really the first V-plow mounted on the front of the truck. And it's the city shops in Watertown. And here's 3 or 4 of the old underslung plows that sat mid-truck mounted. And then the last one to the right is a V-plow that's front mounted. And that was really the start of the first transition to what we know today. And along came the wing. I know that I don't know at what point, but they computer modeled some of my grandfather's V-plow designs and found, even by today's standards, that they were very efficient. He was always trying to be efficient plowing snow and how it rolled the snow and broke the facets off the snowflake so that you weren't moving so much. I don't know whether any of you have ever seen a rollover in action, but that's something else. I can remember going out to Fort Drum when I was young, and I think it was a big Oshkosh or FWD, and rolling down the airport runway at Fort Drum at 60, 70 miles an hour, throwing snow forever. And what they found was, when they tried it on some of the throughways, the interstate, was that they had to stop, because what it would do would pick up an object and throw it clear over on the other lane and break windows in cars. So it wasn't so good. It was really made for airports. The thing had the big, huge ring gear in it, so that whole plow, I don't know whether anybody here ever saw one, but it flopped over. So it had a planetary gear in it, and then you take that whole plow. It had to have a special lift on the front to go really high, because the whole plow went over, so you could go this way with one pass, go down the end of the runway, flip it over again, and cast the snow in the same direction. And then usually sometimes you really didn't even need a wing with that, because it threw the snow so far. And that was not my grandfather's invention. That was Bill Kenyon that designed that plow. And I think all the intellectual property, probably in 98 or 99, was purchased by Wausau, which is Wausau Everest in Montreal. And I think to this day, you could probably call them up and ask for a rollover, and they could probably still make it. And they still will make a Frank snowplow for you. But they bought all the patents and designs. They also pioneered my grandfather started dreaming about this in the 1950s, a plastic plow, because when it's slushy here, like it gets in northern New York, the plow would all become stuck with slush and wouldn't throw any snow. It just sort of balled up in front and rolled off. And he dreamed of a plastic plow of some nature that the snow would stick to, and eventually that became a reality. But what it was the material, which is high HD, high density copolymer, was not developed until probably into the 70s. And that's when they started making the, what I call a plastic plow. I actually have one. Ed Bannister, who was the sales manager at Frank's for years, sent to me. And there, you still see them all over. I have lived in the Gunnison, Colorado area for years. The airport has Frank plows. The city of Gunnison has Frank plows. The town of Mount Crested Butte has Frank plows. Most of them plastic ones. And so it's interesting that there was a lot of connections with dealers. The main dealer in New York State was Joe George in Syracuse. There are number one, Howard P. Fairfield Company in Skowhegan, Maine, which is still in existence to this day. And they were big Frank dealers. The Howard P. Fairfield Company basically covered Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and even Massachusetts. They sold plows. And one of the interesting things was, at one point, they had my grandfather Frank make a plow to plow up potatoes. It wasn't used for plowing snow, it was used to plow up potatoes in Maine. The connection there was that Howard Fairfield's wife, Marion, worked at the plant during World War II, and that's where he met her. Another interesting thing is that there were a lot of women that worked at Frank snowplows in World War II because so many of the men were off at war. They were welders, they were cut the steel. There were a lot of women that worked over there. And most people don't remember that. My grandfather wouldn't have done well in this day and age because he was essentially a male chauvinist. Women had their place, and it wasn't, I'm sure he struggled with women working in the plant, but he didn't have any choice. Except, I don't know whether anybody here remembers Alice and George Revier. Does anybody remember them? A few people do. My cousin Jim does, I do. Alice Revier was the one exception. Alice Revier was the business end of Frank Snowplows for years. She ran the business. My grandfather really wasn't interested in running the business end of it. He was more interested in being in the shop, tinkering, and didn't really like the business end of it, to be honest with you. So Alice, that was his one exception when it came to women. Alice essentially was a business end for years and years of Frank Snowplows. Most people don't realize that.
That's why she had her own airplane.
Yes. Right. She had a daughter in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
That's where I lived when I met her.
Yeah. Yeah. Most people don't remember Alice and George Revier. Yeah. But she was a smart lady. Yeah. There are so many people. I'm sure there's some Frank Snowplow employees here. I basically moved to Colorado in the early 70s, and I've been coming back summers for the last 7 or 8 years, and then periodically in between, so I lost a lot of connection when I moved away in the early 70s to what was going on over there. The Simpson family bought it from my family essentially in the mid-60s, I think about 1965. They were from Canada. At the time, they also owned a couple other things in Canada. My dad worked for them briefly. Looking at what they had in Canada, they had, I think, a truck axle manufacturing. They had several other businesses, and my dad didn't work for them very long because he said they didn't even know what they bought, and that they're all going to fail at some point. The only thing they ended up with in the end was Frank, and they were basically, I think, living on the name, the fact that it was basically the standard of the industry. The government, all the government specs, U.S. government specs for the Army and Air Force were all the Frank, and so for years they had that business locked up. Same thing with the Corps of Engineers. I know I was having breakfast one day in Gunnison, Colorado, at a place called the hotel, and the Cattleman's Hotel, and walked outside, and there was a rollover. And people were balking at it because to put it on the truck, it was on a lowboy, the narrow part of the plow was like this. They had rotated it so the plow went up in front of the truck, and nobody could figure out what it was. And they were looking at it, and I go, oh, well, what's that? And I said, well, that's a rollover plow. Well, what's a rollover plow? I said, you can take that plow and go like this. You can make it do circles. I said, so you put it on one way, you put it on the other way. And I thought, well, I went over and I asked the driver, I said, well, where are you delivering that? Well, at that time, they were building a dam on the Gunnison River. There were two of them that produced power, Blue Mesa and Morro Point. And the third dam was Crystal Dam. It was made to even out the flow in the river when they pushed the water through early in the morning and in the evening to make power, when we used our power. And I thought, well, why do they need a rollover to plow the road into a dam? Wouldn't a power reversible work just fine? But that's the government. That's where we're going. I thought that was just hilarious. I said, well, I figured it was going to an airport someplace. You can go literally any place in the world. You can go to the top of Mount Kea and the observatory in Hawaii. You're going to find a Frank snowplow. His patents were licensed in Europe. So you could go to Munich, Germany, and the airport there was years ago, I don't know about now, but would have rollovers. So there was really, the product was used around the world. Any place there was snow, there was a Frank snowplow. I have here, and this is how complex it is. There's one. This is one of his patents from March 17, 1933, and it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of explanation on the bends and the working of a V-plow. And this would have been probably the second or third iteration of that design. He held a lot of patents, and that was the key to his success, was that he patented everything. And so he was constantly in battles with other manufacturers for infringing on patent rights. Does anybody remember Flink, F-L-I-N-K? I don't know whether it's in existence or not, but what it was a play on Frank. And they copied a lot of his designs, and so he was constantly in a court battle with them to stop using his patented designs. I think maybe they were down in Pennsylvania or something. But it was a play on words. It was Flink, F-L-I-N-K, not F-R-I-N-K. And so it was a constant, he kept some patent attorneys in New York City pretty busy from time to time because he liked to protect his intellectual property. He figured it was his idea, he ought to keep it, I guess. There were, Frank Canada was very successful. Again, it was owned by a separate business entity, and they made almost every plow in Canada for years. because of using my grandfather's patents, and there really wasn't any other manufacturers over there. Then along came Viking in Harrisville, which became a big competitor, and that was really the thing that I think sunk Frank. Was the state contract was won by Viking and not Frank, and it was always a big, kept the plant busy for years and years. They always got the state contract for both the Thruway and the state highway department. And that, when they lost that, I think that was pretty much the demise of them. And even at the end, what they had done was they had sold the intellectual property, the trademark, patents, what were left, and sold them to Everest up in, which is now Wausau Everest, up in Montreal. And they had a lot of longtime dealers. There was one in Denver that sold Frank snowplows up until just a few years ago. And so any place I went, and you went in New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, to this day you still see Frank snowplows. And, they had dealers, literally, any place there was snow, they had dealers, long-term dealers all over the place. He had a dislike for international trucks. He called them junk. He did not think that Frank snowplows should go on international trucks. And he hated the state because of it, because they always bought cheap international trucks. And he liked Mack. I can still remember the two brothers that started Mack Trucks coming to my grandfather's farm once a year. We were relegated to the kitchen when they came and had dinner, and they went. Some of you will remember my grandfather's fishing guide, Noel Lone, and they would come fishing every year. He liked Max. Some of you people here might remember Brockways, which was even a heavier version of a Mack. He liked FWDs. He liked Oshkoshes. Anything heavy. He just felt that internationals weren't built heavy enough to plow snow, that you needed a specialized truck. They made, I don't know, I can remember, and Tommy Slate was the one that always welded the aluminum plow. And early in the 50s, that plows for the Air Force were either FWDs or Oshkosh. Everything on them was aluminum except the engine. Aluminum cab, aluminum frames, aluminum wheels, aluminum everything, because they put them on transport planes. They had either a V-plow or a big reversible and double wings. Everything was aluminum. The whole, everything. The plows, everything that could be aluminum was aluminum, because they wanted to put them on a transport plane. And I don't think that they have produced one of those, they produced one of those in later years. I don't remember that. But that was interesting because of the configuration of the truck, you climbed up a ladder, and there was a hatchway in the top of the cab, and you climbed in that to get into the truck. And there was something to see when they left here. Sometimes the snowplows left here on the railroad years ago. They would put them on a flat car and ship them God knows where. All the steel came in by rail, as well as the coal, when Consol Hall was operating, fueling all the ships, and most of the businesses and homes in Clayton all were heated by coal. And so the train would come in from Pennsylvania, and when a group of us, when we were kids, we would catch an empty train headed out to the trestle. They just rebuilt for the Ingerson Trail, and we jumped off there and then walked back to town. And I wasn't the only one who did that. I'm sure our parents wouldn't approve of it. So there are a lot of pictures over here. There are more at the museum. I would urge you, if you want to look at, you can watch the transition from early on until later years, how they looked and how they operated. My son and I were looking at the pictures where everything were chain falls. They literally used chain falls to lift the plows and the wings. And there's one interesting picture there. There's two guys in the back of the truck, and that's what they operated with, the wings. There's a video that was produced by, I have a copy of it. Unfortunately, it's on a 8-track tape, so I don't think there's anything to play that with. That I think Wausau Everest did it, and it was on the Tug Hill Plateau, probably sometime in the 1930s. My grandfather's in that, and it was a Walter snow fighter, and the roads had drifted in, and they'd back up, and then they'd ram it, and it'd fall out. And the snow was so hard that everybody could walk. And I can remember, I picked my grandfather out right away, walking alongside the truck, watching the plow open the road. They actually had a good working relationship. They put a lot of plows on Caterpillar dozers. They put plows on Caterpillar motor graders years ago, until Caterpillar bought a company called Balderson. And then Cat basically could equip their equipment, particularly the motor graders, to this day, almost everything is Balderson, which they own. It's a division of Caterpillar. I don't know in recent years whether they did it, but there's some pictures over there where they made brooms that you could attach just like a snowplow and hook up with your hydraulic line, and you could sweep the street. They actually, that was very successful years ago. There was a lot of those around. Most of the municipalities, particularly here in northern New York, bought them. Once in a while you go, wow, what's a snowplow going down the road this time of year? And it generally had a boom on it. They made snow blowers. They were the first ones to make a snow blower that was hydraulically operated and to attach to a loader. And they, what was nice about that, what Bill Kenyon was trying to do, was eliminate the shear pins that particularly the C-cards in Watertown used, because if you got something stuck in there, a big chunk of ice, you sheared the pin on the shaft, and then you had to get the snow out of there, take the old pin out, put a new pin in. What was nice about the hydraulics is you could just reverse the augers and kick whatever was in there out. That, for some reason, never took off very well, and I don't know why, but they were the first ones to use hydraulics in a snowblower. I can remember going around town using it to blow back banks. The village of Clayton and the town of Clayton were beneficiaries for years of Frink snowplows because they did some of the testing for free. Got free plows. And so that's when they found out that things didn't work sometimes. This broke or that broke. They were noted to be basically the Cadillac of the snowplows because they were so well built. And one of the selling points was, well, that plow is going to last 3 trucks. You take it, you buy a new truck, you take the stuff off the old one, you put it on the new one, and you use it again. And maybe, if you're lucky, you put a coat of paint on it. And sometimes, years ago, they would bring the new trucks back with the plow and the wings and everything in the back to have everything remounted over here. And then they would put them through the paint shop, paint them, and whatever needed to be repaired. That was always interesting. That was one. And once in a while, you'll be driving around someplace and you'll see an old plow in a junkyard. And not very many of the earliest stuff that is still around. There is a museum that has at least one, maybe two of the Lynn trucks, the half tracks with freight plows on. But the museum has one, it's an old V plow. It probably dates from the 1930s out in the back of the museum. Nobody probably knows it's even there. But a lot of the old plows, you know, everything got basically cut up for scrap only. So there's really not any of the original underslung plows. A lot of the original stuff does not exist anymore, unfortunately. My grandfather also made model plows of everything he had, and the museum has all those. I don't know, I'd have to ask Tom where they're at over there, but there's
some on display.
there's some out on display. Yeah, so he made models of everything, small models. As a kid, I had one that I pushed around on a rudimentary wagon and plowed the sidewalk. That my grandfather had given me. Does anybody have any questions?
Did you ever work with a company or remember hearing when you were small, Dempster? I'm from a farm family in southwest Kansas, and Dempster drills and plows and one-ways were like the cutting edge industry. And my dad in the 60s, we were one of the only people probably in the United States that was still using Dempsters until we couldn't find parts anywhere in the United States. They were long, they were tough, and they were the standard for plowing fields and for one-way farming, a mile by a mile by a mile. I just wondered if you'd ever heard of that.
No, I never
That
had.
company. It was just,
No.
so once we didn't do that anymore, my dad was one of the very first people that started no-till farming because everything broke after 2 or 3 weeks of using, so he got frustrated from welding it himself, like my grandparents did, and we just waited. No, there was nothing followed. I mean, even John Deere is not nearly the same.
Mr. Ryman, I've got one question. How do you get a snowplow to Denver, Colorado from here?
Early years when the railroad was in here, you went by railroad, and then once railroad went out in, I believe, the late 50s, early 60s, everything was trucked.
That's a big thing to truck.
Pardon me?
That's a heavy, big thing to truck.
Yeah, it generally went on a flatbed or lowboy, and multiple.
Would someone from New Jersey drive their new truck up to have the plow mounted here?
Yes, that was typically how, at least in this multi-state area around us, that a lot of them were mounted here. And there was a shop, a newer part of the building that was on this south side that was, you know, and the lot in back of where the hotel is, that, I can remember that as a kid just being packed with trucks. When you go off 81, it's an Iowa company that builds the plows in Iowa and a lot of stuff and then brings it in. They probably in their lot hit a tenth of what used to be here. I mean, it was just wow. And you know, you'd see everything. You'd see internationals, you'd see the Broccoli's, the Max, the FWDs, the Kenworths. You'd see a lot of Walter Snowfighters.
So Frank was probably the last customer of the railroad.
Yes. And then the big thing for the railroad was bringing the coal in for Consol Hall. That was the main thing. The trains would come in out of Pennsylvania to basically fuel the ships. The house I grew up in, a block up the street here, they actually, Clarence Hall built in the 1930s. Of course, that had a coal-fired boiler in it. And my brother and I, that was our job. They had, oh my God, 2 or 3 coal trucks that they went around town in conveyors, and before they did Riverside Drive here, there were, if you walked down the sidewalk, you would see the manhole covers for a lot of the buildings, and what that was to put coal in. So they pop the manhole cover and bring the truck, tip it up, and have a little conveyor, and down with the coal into the coal bin. I can, yeah, I mean, everything here in the 50s was still on coal, and then gradually that all transitioned to fuel oil, and some of it eventually propane. But that was a huge business. Yes?
In the 70s, the Chamber of Commerce got together with Frank and they started an international snowplowing contest on Grace
Uh-huh. It was
Street. That went on for,
held on James Street.
I remember.
That was the one I remember, with all the different cones and obstacles, and, yeah, that was sort of a big deal.
It went like 3 years before it stopped snowing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that's, you know, the women used to get in trouble because when you get a lot of snow, you don't know where the mailboxes are. So you had to remember where all the snow, all the mailboxes were, so you didn't wipe them up with a wing. Because people got mad.
Still happens.
I got most of my cravings.
Yeah, I can remember in the latter years of Frank's, before they closed up, I worked at Drum, and we'd have to order parts.
Mhm.
And I always was really glad when I made a phone call over there. If I got Norma Zimmer, she was always right on top of it. If you told her what you thought you needed, she knew her business, and you got the right part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was interesting in that fire of 1960, my dad had concentrate on, if you look at the old pictures, the offices were upstairs, and then there was an office area, and of course, computers didn't exist. You didn't have computer files with all your designs and everything. And my dad had the fire department specifically target that with water to keep the fire out of it so that they wouldn't lose all their drawings, particularly their drawings. And it took weeks and weeks and weeks once they retrieved everything to dry things out and then redraw things because there was a lot of damage.
Are there Frank patented plows still produced today anywhere?
Wausau Everest, or it's Wausau Everest now. Back then in 2000 it was just Everest. All the patents had basically expired, and really what they bought was a Frank trade name, and that was it. All the patents had long expired. Probably the last patent to expire was that Reversa-Cast. You ever see one of those, a plastic plow where you had a hydraulic cylinder on each end, where you could shape the plow to throw the snow left or right? It was on a reversible. I think that was the last patent there was from Frank. I don't know who came up with that, but somebody did, and I think that has since expired.
You know when the peak employment was for Frank located here?
Pardon me?
Do you know when the peak employment was for Frank? Was it
I would say it was probably in the 50s and 60s, and let me explain why. When Eisenhower started the interstate system, that's when Frank's snowplows really took off. They couldn't keep up because they were building interstates that needed snow removal equipment faster than they could, be honest with you, faster than they could produce it. You look at all the snowplows on all the interstates, just look at 81. I mean, you hear all your segments 81, they all have big shops, they all have a lot of snowplows. And it's throughout New York State and other states too, whether it's Ohio or Vermont, any place for snow. And that's when the business during the 50s and 60s and probably even into the 70s was at its peak. Definitely during the 50s and 60s when they were building the interstate system.
Was it over 1,000 people at peak, you think?
No, there's probably never more than probably 200 or 300 working over there.
Okay.
And I can remember 3 shifts a day. Simply because the fiscal years for all the governments started, a lot of them started January 1, and that's when they ordered their plows. they could release the money to, in their, the budget for that particular year, that's when they released the money, and that's when the plant during the winter was like, wow. And it would have been nice, my grandfather would always make, we'd always make, they made plows, try to guess what people were gonna buy, and they made plows all the rest of the year in the summer, hoping what they made, people were gonna, that way they were ahead of the game a little bit with some of this stuff. And each truck required a different lifting frame. So you really couldn't make those, but you could make the snow plows because it was a universal mount. It didn't matter what frame it was, but each truck brand had different frame rail depth, frame rail dimension between them, and so that they could not make until they knew exactly what was coming in. And unfortunately, I think they would have really liked to have seen it even out over the years, but it never worked that way.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that changed in later years or not, to be honest with you. Whether it was just a craziness over there in the winter, or whether maybe this smoothed out a little bit. But they used to bring all the steel that come in, like later years, once the railroad went out, all the steel would come in great big gondola cars. And I mean, just stacks of the different angle, channel, a lot of plate. And there was a little spur that went right up to the plant over here, because the main one went right down through here to across the street to Console Hall. And then they unloaded the cars there, the coal cars. But everything came in, very little bit by truck. It was all by rail for years and years until the railroad left.
When they had their auction, and I believe it was in 2000, did you happen to attend the auction?
Pardon me?
When they auctioned off Frank's, all the equipment, did you happen to attend that auction?
No, I did not. Really, it was my understanding that there really wasn't a lot to auction off. That it was all older equipment, that was, a lot of it was obsolete. Yeah, so, and they had, basically, there hadn't been any money put into that in a long time. To upgrade, you know, the pantographs, the lathes, things like that. They just, there was no money really put into the business. The only thing that really they did was, it was an ironic situation. My dad for years tried to buy the Riverview Hotel from Jack Farnham because their fire insurance at the plant was crazy expensive because it was a 3-story wooden structure. And ironically, the plant burned first before the hotel did. Eventually, he did succeed in buying that, and that's where the office building, that's where the Riverview Hotel was. And that had been there a long time because people would come in on the train when they had passenger service here, and that was one of the places they could stay, as well as other, you know, that's another interesting part of the waterfront here in Clayton, is all the people who used to come up from, you know, particularly the New York City area, and go to the islands. All the steam boats that came in here. Any other questions?
Yes. Did they ever try to build plows for the railroad?
Pardon me?
For the railroad?
Railroad plows.
Yes, at one time I think they did do that. Build some for the railroad. Definitely not rotary plows, but they did make, at one point, they did make some for the railroad. And then, of course, they just put them on a railroad car and get out of here. They all went on, generally on a locomotive that was specifically made for snow. There are pictures, particularly out where I've been in Colorado for a number of years. And, you know, snow higher than this room, and the train with a plow going through it. And then they use a lot of rotary plows too. You know, they huge, the blower on it the wheel on the blower was almost, it was 10 feet tall, and it would shoot snow, 100, 150 feet in the mountains. And they, I know, and I'm pretty sure they did make some for the railroad. And you'll see some that are interesting. They used to put them on cattle tractors, tracked, and they have these massive wings on them, massive wings to wing back, and the reason that was because they go through anything. They just keep going with the tracks. They have a lot of traction. And there's a lot of interesting pictures over there of all the different variations of things that were made over the years in this plant. They also made some things for other manufacturers. There were some, my grandfather had a relationship early on with Gradall. Are you familiar with them?
Yep.
And actually made some components for Gradall for a while when they first started. There's years and years ago, because they've been around a long time. But the big thing for the snowplow industry was really, him in particular, was the advent of hydraulics. And he always felt it was better. I don't know in later years, but he always made all of his own hydraulic cylinders. The pumps and the hoses and stuff and the valves, he bought those out, but he made all the hydraulic cylinders because he didn't think anybody made them tough enough. So they made everything over there. There were a lot of lathes in the plant. And that was one of the main things that happened with the fire in 1960. It was hot enough, it warped all the beds on the lathes, and they had to buy all new lathes. It destroyed a lot of stuff over there, is what it did. But the big thing, the big ticket item, it destroyed all the lathes. It got so hot in there, it warped the bed on the lathes, and then the lathe wasn't any good to do anything anymore. That was another fascinating thing to watch the guys, start with a piece of stock. And, it wasn't like today where it's all computer numerical control, and you basically put the piece in the machine and punch a button and the computer does everything. It flips the tools, and back then there were a lot of wonderful machinists here years ago. A little side anecdote to that would be, how many people remember Stabler and Baker graphic controls? Okay, they made all the machines for graphic controls were made here in Clayton that cut, punched, and printed the paper for all their products. Yeah. And there was wonderful machinists here for years. A lot of them worked at Frank, some worked up there. He had Black Clawson, had New York Airbrake, and there were and I think that basically has become a lost art. A good machinist, you can't find them anymore. There's no, what would you call it, like an apprentice program or something anymore. It's tough to find a good machinist. There were a lot of them right over here at Frank's. I can remember Saturdays were, some of the foremen were expected to come in when I was a little kid, and Saturdays was invent days, and that's when they made prototypes of things to try out. So there was welding, cutting, whatever, and that was always fun because I could get to go and watch how they did everything. That's when they experimented with different things, different designs. They might, try a different curve on a snowplow or something like that, putting in the brake and making all the brakes all the way around. So I have some very fond memories when I was a little kid in the plant, monkeying around. There were, my grandfather employed Noel Rowan for, oh my God, I think his whole life. He, fishing guide, a lot of the dealers came in, truck manufacturers, executives from the truck manufacturers came in every summer, usually the same week or days, and went fishing. And Noel would then go to work in the winter at the plant. He worked in the plant during the winters and fish 7 days a week all summer.
Curious, did they ever determine what caused the fire?
Yes. I mentioned that earlier, the paint room, paint the snowplow was within the plant. In fact, it was sort of basically more on the east side center. And of course, everything was oil-based paints and rags from painting, spontaneous combustion. All the paint came from, I don't know, here's another name to throw out, Strathmore Paint, Syracuse. That's where all the paint for years and years and years came from, Strathmore. All the paint to paint the snowplows. And there were a lot of long-term, supplier relationships with hydraulic manufacturers, hose manufacturers, paint. City Potters here used to sell them decals, didn't you? Yeah, clothes. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of suppliers that were used for years and years and years. Once they found somebody they liked, they jumped stuck with them. So that's really, I lost, Bob Purcell, good.
Hey, two related questions. Okay. First of all, was the initial power design for the Daily bus line your grandfather?
Yeah, for Fred Daly.
Was it the first V-shaped power design your grandfather made?
That came a little bit later. The ones for Fred were all undermount.
Oh, okay.
Okay? And they were all made up where Hunter's Market is. That was his first manufacturing plant, which really, when you look at it, wasn't very big. And it took him a very short time before he built this down here.
How much later was it that the V-shaped plow came about?
The V-shaped plow would come later in the 1920s. And that picture that my sister had grown up, that was from the museum, really shows that transition. And it was at the City Watertown shop, and there are three undermount plows, and the far right is the first V plow, front mounted. And it required a winch to pick it up.
Then the related question, it's a little puzzle to me looking back. I think the V-shaped plow would cast snow to either side, both sides.
That is correct.
So how would it be used other than if they're a single lane path? That is, you plowed a single lane and you try to come back the opposite direction for the second adjacent lane, it would cast snow back over the lane you're plowing.
There are pictures of that in there, and that's what they did for a long time until my grandfather Frank devised the wings. And it didn't take them long to do that, to figure out they needed something to put on either side of the V-plow to get the snow back. And what they would do is you first punch through with the V-plow. You wouldn't typically, if it was real deep, you wouldn't use the wings. They were tucked in, and once you punched a hole through the snow with the V-plow, then you went back and you started dropping your wings and pushing the snow back. If there wasn't a lot of snow, they would go through the V-plow and put the wings down. But sometimes what it would take was you would take the wings, and you obviously couldn't just push a lot of snow without bogging the truck down. So what you do, you incrementally just keep going back and forth, lowering the wing a little bit every time until you push the snow back. But everything, it's interesting to look at some of the pictures. Everything was chain fall operated. It was pretty rudimentary. You hand put out the plows and block the pin, depending on how far out you wanted. It slid on steel tubes, and then you pinned how far out. And eventually that all became hydraulic like it is today. In fact, you can look at some of the early hydraulic designs, and they're the same today as they were back in probably the 40s when they started using hydraulics. So 40, 60, 80 years ago. A lot of the designs have not changed at all. They're still the same. The one thing that went away is very rare to see a one-way plow. Again, that's because of hydraulics, and you take the two cylinders and you just tip it one way or the other. That's when the advent of that happened, the power reversible. Up until that point, you just cast the snow to the right.
We'll make this the last question.
I was just curious, do you guys know where that small V-plow is behind the museum? What it was mounted on?
I don't think anybody does. I can't even remember. One time I knew where that had come from.
Yeah, when I started working at the museum as the historian, it was already there.
The only person, and I know I knew at one point, and I can't remember, was Norm Wagner and told me where it came from.
I believe it does have a 1929 on the plow.
Yeah.
That ought to be preserved.
Next.
Well, Carl, you're definitely a proud grandson. 80 years of information. It's kind of hard to put 80 years of information into a 1-hour program. You definitely shared a lot of information today, and information that I learned from as historian, but again, all the people here. As part of our sesquicentennial year, it's a certificate of appreciation for joining us today. And thank you for bringing family. I understand you have a sister that arrived. So, all right.
Well, very had probably as much or more knowledge than I did, particularly in later years, was Norm Wagner, who just passed away a few years ago. His dad, Mike Wagner, worked for my grandfather's entire life as a farmer. So he and I got together every once in a while, and I learned things from him, and he learned things from me. But he was a wealth of knowledge and sorely missed.
Carl, I'm going to ask you to help me on something. So I wanted to make sure everyone signed in earlier, and there was a reason for that. And the first item is a proclamation. It's our sesquicentennial year. The mayor released this earlier this year. It's her signature. And Linda, if you could tell us who signed in on line number 32. And we'll see if they're still here. I know it's getting close to that lunch hour, and a few people had to leave. But number 32.
Ken Sachs.
Is there an individual here by Ken? How about 33?
Barb Fisher.
Barb Fisher? They probably came together. 34.
Sandra Ferrantino.
Oh, come on forward. I'm going to let Carl do the presentation. Just giving you a copy of that.
Can she have the bottle?
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Now, this one, I got more back at the office. I think I need to give you one of these. But we're going to give this to who's guest 18. This is a bottle of wine, sesquicentennial label.
Cheryl Mowat. She left.
She left. How about 19?
Mary Hagan.
Oh. And I honestly had no idea who these numbers are.
Good work, Mayor. I'll be over in a couple of minutes, Mayor.
We welcome, there are plenty of things to look around on. Also, we have the Les Corbin Studio Sesquicentennial exhibit going on. Please walk around the room and take a look at all the wonderful photos. Thank you.